Rain has fallen on this piece of iron for more than 16 centuries. It should be a crumbling stump of rust by now. It is not. Somewhere in Delhi stands a solid iron pillar, taller than a two-story house, forged when the Roman Empire still ruled the Mediterranean, centuries before most of the monuments now considered ancient were even built. Almost no rust. Nobody fully agrees why. Iron rusts. That is not a theory, it is a law of chemistry every blacksmith and every car owner has learned the hard way. And yet here, in one of the most humid climates on Earth, this rule seems to bend. We will get to the explanation, and it involves an accident nobody was trying to engineer. But first you need to understand what this thing actually is, and how strange it already was on the day it was raised. This is the Iron Pillar of Delhi, standing today inside the Qutb complex in the Mehrauli district, surrounded by the ruins of mosques and towers built centuries after the pillar itself was already ancient. It has not always stood here. Near its base runs a line of ancient Sanskrit script, several feet of flowing Gupta-era characters cut directly into the metal. It describes a king who crushed his enemies in battle across a great river and conquered lands to the east, and states plainly that the pillar was raised on a hill as a flagstaff in honor of the god Vishnu. For centuries scholars argued over whose name it honored. Today most agree the inscription praises a king called Chandra, and the strongest candidate is Chandragupta II, a powerful ruler of the Gupta Empire around the turn of the 5th century. The Gupta age is remembered as a golden era of Indian science, mathematics and art. This pillar may be one of its last surviving fingerprints, standing when almost everything else from that world has crumbled to dust. It was not made where it stands now. Most historians believe it originally stood elsewhere, possibly at a temple site far to the south, before being moved to Delhi roughly 900 years ago by a later ruler. Moving a 6-ton solid iron shaft across hundreds of kilometers, without cranes, without trucks, without a single modern machine, was itself an engineering feat most people never even think to admire. But moving it is nothing next to the problem of making it in the first place. The pillar stands just over 7 meters tall and weighs roughly 6 tons. It is not cast in a mold like a modern lamppost. It is solid wrought iron, hammered together from smaller pieces by hand. In the 5th century nobody could melt iron into a liquid and pour it. Furnaces of that age produced a spongy lump called a bloom, mixed with slag, that had to be hammered, not poured, into shape. To build something this size, smiths had to forge dozens, maybe over 100, of these blooms together, reheating each piece to a bright welding heat and hammering the glowing faces into one another before the metal could cool, blow after blow, fusing them into a single seamless column with no rivets, no bolts, and no visible joints. Modern metallurgists who have studied the pillar are blunt about it. Producing an object this large, this uniform, using furnace technology from the 5th century, is a genuine feat that would tax even a well-equipped workshop today. So it was already remarkable before a single drop of rain ever touched it. Then the centuries began. Delhi is not a kind climate for iron. Monsoon humidity soaks the air for months. Temperatures swing hard between seasons. Ordinary iron left outside here can rust through in a matter of years. You can see the proof standing right next to the pillar. Other iron and steel fittings added to the site in later centuries have visibly corroded, flaking, and pitted, within living memory. The pillar itself shows almost none of that. A faint, stable, dark surface layer. No flaking scale. No pitting. After 1600 rainy seasons, monsoon after monsoon, it looks essentially the same as it did the century before. For a long time, nobody could say exactly why. And into that gap, legends grew. One popular belief held that if you could stand with your back to the pillar and wrap your arms fully around it behind you, your wish would come true. For generations, hopeful hands polished the lower section smooth. Colonial-era visitors floated their own theories. Some assumed the metal itself must be some exotic, unrusting alloy, perhaps even meteoric iron fallen from the sky. It was tested more than once. It is not meteoric. It is ordinary-looking wrought iron, smelted from local ore. The mystery was never the metal's origin. It was something else entirely. By the 20th century the pillar had become something of an embarrassment to modern engineering. Cast iron pipes and bridges built in the 1800s and 1900s were rusting away in decades. This 5th century column simply was not. Committees studied it. Chemists scraped tiny samples from its surface. For most of the century, the honest answer stayed the same: we are not entirely sure. The breakthrough, when it finally came, did not come from a single dramatic discovery. It came from patiently reading the metal itself, atom by atom, layer by layer, using tools no 5th century smith could have imagined, X-ray diffraction to identify exactly which minerals had formed, and electron microscopy to map how those minerals were arranged in cross-section. In the early 2000s, a team led by the Indian metallurgist R. Balasubramaniam finally cracked the case, running electron microprobe analysis and X-ray diffraction on tiny samples scraped from the surface, and the answer turned out to hide in an element nobody had thought to blame or credit: phosphorus. Ancient Indian iron smelting used a particular high-purity ore, reduced slowly in a small charcoal-fired bloomery rather than a coke-fired blast furnace, at temperatures never hot enough to melt the metal outright. That slow, low-temperature process left unusually high levels of phosphorus locked into the finished iron, far higher than modern steel would ever tolerate. Modern steelmakers treat phosphorus as an impurity to be eliminated because it makes iron brittle under stress. Nobody was trying to engineer rust resistance. It was, by every account, an accident of the process. But that phosphorus, combined with the way the metal was repeatedly hammered and folded during forging, changes everything about how the surface reacts to weather over time. When iron this rich in phosphorus is exposed to rain and dries repeatedly, it does not just rust and flake like ordinary iron. Electron microscope cross-sections show it slowly growing a thin, tightly bonded mineral skin only a few dozen microns deep, rich in iron, oxygen, and phosphorus, that researchers eventually named Mr. White. Ordinary rust flakes away, exposing fresh metal underneath to attack again and again. This phosphate-rich skin instead clings to the surface, thickening with each wet season instead of peeling off. In effect, the pillar built its own armor, one monsoon at a time, out of the very process that was supposedly attacking it. That is the mechanism. But knowing the mechanism is not the same as being able to repeat it on command, and this is where the story gets genuinely humbling for modern industry. Modern steel production is built almost entirely around removing phosphorus, not concentrating it. Reproducing the exact ore chemistry, the smelting temperature, and the specific hammering regimen of 5th century smiths is not simple, and nobody has fully replicated a match at this scale. There is also a scale problem money cannot easily solve. This is one carefully forge welded column, made slowly by specialists over what was likely months of dedicated labor, not a mass-produced industrial product. And something else has been quietly lost too, the specific traditional know-how of exactly how those smiths judged their ore, their fire, and their hammering by eye and feel, with no written formula passed down intact. So the honest modern answer is this: we can explain why it works. We cannot yet casually mass-produce it. The pillar's real secret was never magic. It was a specific, hard-won craft tradition that outpaced our own industrial habits by accident. Which makes what almost happened to it in the 20th century sting even more. By the 1990s, the pillar's smooth lower surface, worn by a century of wishing hands and, worse, by curious visitors scratching graffiti and coins into the ancient metal, was showing real damage for the first time in its long life. Not from rain, not from rust, from us. In 1997, authorities finally fenced the base to stop the touching that had done more visible harm in 100 years than the weather had managed in 16 centuries. It is a strange kind of irony. The metal that quietly out-engineered the sky needed protecting, in the end, from curious hands rather than from the monsoon. And the pillar is not entirely alone in this story. Ancient Indian smiths raised other iron works of serious scale, including a now-fallen pillar once documented at the further evidence this was a mastered tradition, not a single lucky accident. So this was never one miracle object. It was the visible peak of a broader iron-working tradition across ancient India, most of which has simply not survived intact for us to examine. Which raises an obvious question. If they could do this in the 5th century, why did later iron work, even centuries closer to our own time, rust so much faster? Part of the answer is economic. Once large-scale iron production spread, speed and volume mattered more than the slow, phosphorus-rich, heavily hand-worked methods of earlier smiths. Efficiency, in a sense, quietly traded away the very property that made this pillar special. It is a pattern that shows up again and again in the history of ancient technology. Faster and cheaper is not always better. Sometimes it means quietly leaving behind a property nobody realized mattered until centuries later. Today the pillar remains one of the most studied pieces of ancient metal on the planet, and still draws fresh scientific papers using X-ray diffraction and electron microscopy to map exactly how its passive layer behaves under different humidity and temperature conditions, decades after the first serious analysis began. Engineers working on modern corrosion-resistant coatings have specifically studied its phosphate skin for ideas, chasing, 16 centuries later, a trick ancient smiths stumbled into without ever writing down a reason. So the next time someone tells you the ancients could not have built something without help from elsewhere, point them here. Not to aliens. To phosphorus, fire, and patience. This was not a monument built to defy chemistry. It was built to honor a king, and it happened to be made so well that chemistry simply had less to say about it than usual. Every rainy season since has tested it. Every rainy season it has answered the same way. There is something almost defiant in that consistency. 16 centuries of monsoons, invasions, empires rising and collapsing around it, and the metal itself simply keeps standing, largely unchanged, in the same courtyard. Dynasties that once ruled this ground are gone. Their palaces are rubble. Their names survive mostly in books. The pillar they raised, or that others raised before them and moved here, is still upright. Which brings us back to where we started. A piece of iron that should have rusted through generations ago, and did not, because of a happy accident buried in its own atoms. We know the chemistry now. Phosphorus-rich wrought iron, repeatedly hammer-folded, forming a self-renewing mineral skin under wet and dry cycles. That part is settled science. What is not settled is whether we could deliberately recreate a column this size with this exact property today, cheaply, at scale, on purpose. Nobody has managed it yet. Which means, in a very real sense, the smiths who forged this pillar in the 5th century still know something our own industry has not fully caught up to. Not through mysticism. Through an oar, a fire, a hammer, and a depth of hands-on skill that has not been fully written down or fully rebuilt since. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. In an age of alloys designed by supercomputers and tested in wind tunnels, a 5th century column made entirely by hand still outlasts most of what we build on purpose today. That is not an insult to modern engineering. It is a reminder that skill, patience, and a willingness to work slowly can sometimes outproduce speed and scale, even by accident. And it is a reminder that not every ancient mystery needs a lost civilization or a visitor from the stars to explain it. Sometimes the real answer is stranger and better. Ordinary people, extraordinary craft. Visitors still gather at the fence around its base today, phones and cameras raised, most having no idea they are looking at one of metallurgy's genuine unsolved puzzles, only partly solved barely 2 decades ago. The Sanskrit line near its base still praises a king whose empire is long gone, its borders and capitals forgotten by most. The metal it praises him in has quietly outlasted every empire that came after. Every dynasty that ruled Delhi after the Guptas eventually fell. Every one of their monuments has needed restoration, replacement, or abandonment. The pillar has needed a fence. So when people ask how this pillar has survived 16 centuries of Delhi's brutal monsoons without rusting away, the honest answer is no longer a shrug. It survived because of an accident of ore chemistry that modern industry spent a century trying to eliminate, forged by hand skilled enough to fuse 100 lumps of sponge iron into one seamless column. It survived because that same forging process built a self-renewing mineral skin, one that thickens instead of flaking every single time the rain comes and goes. And it survived, in the end, more from us than from weather. From reverence, mostly. From the fence that finally stopped our hands from doing what 1,000 monsoons could not. 16 centuries from now, if it is still standing, whoever looks at it will likely know even more about why. The metal has already told us most of its secret. We only had to learn how to read it. It was never magic. It was never aliens. It was iron, phosphorus, fire, and patience, in exactly the right combination, forged by people who are otherwise almost entirely forgotten by name. The rain will fall on it again tonight. It will bead, and roll, and leave almost nothing behind, just as it has for 1600 years.